Good morning, Omar. Happy to have you join us, and Mariah as well. Welcome. We're inviting everyone to introduce themselves in the chat box before we get started with the discussion shortly. Welcome, everyone. I think in the interest of time, we will go ahead and get started here at the top of the hour. We have robust participation thus far, and I think additional community members may be joining us along the way, but we will go ahead and get started with our discussion. But before we do, I wanted to share just a couple of housekeeping points. First, the discussion will be following Chatham House rules this morning, and it will also be recorded. As I've noted, for those of you who are joining, we invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat box, please. And then also invite you throughout the discussion to ask questions, pose your questions, and share comments in the chat box as well. In the interest of time, we're not going into deep biographical information about our speakers today, but bios were shared with everyone in advance of this meeting. They were attached to the invitation, so we invite you to go back and look more in depth at those after the meeting. I also wanted to share with everyone that at the very end, there will be a Mentimeter survey. This is a very short survey, and we really encourage and ask everyone if you could please take a few minutes at the end of the event and stay with us and complete that survey. It does help the program be more responsive to the community's interests and to their needs. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think we have folks from really across the globe, which is great. I'm Mary Margaret Deneen. I'm the director of the Global Programs Division at the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative, and also the JusTRAC program team lead. And we are so pleased that you're joining this Justice Sector Measurement Community of Practice meeting focused on measuring results and impact of environmental justice-focused foreign assistance programs and the lessons learned from this emerging field. If you are not already a member of the JusTRAC Knowledge Portal, we encourage you to sign up and become a member of the portal. I'll drop the link in the chat box for those of you who aren't. And we invite everyone after this meeting to use the portal, and particularly the Justice Sector Measurement Discussion Board, to continue the discussion and the information sharing. And the portal also offers you access to curated justice sector measurement resources and tools for use in your daily work. So we really encourage you to take a look at what's available on the portal and to continue today's discussion there afterward. Now, I'm really happy to introduce two JusTRAC Plus program liaisons who've taken the lead on bringing this topic and today's presenters, to the Justice Sector Measurement Community of Practice. Steve Wolfson is a senior attorney in the Office of General Counsel at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and Derry Rydell is the Counsel for Strategic Planning at the U.S. Department of Justice. And I am pleased to turn it over to you, Derry.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Mary Margaret, for that kind introduction. Keenly aware of time, I'm going to err on the side of being too short than too long, because we want to hear from the actual panelists. As Mary Margaret mentioned, I'm with the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Overseas Prosecutorial Development Assistance and Training, quite a mouthful. We're better known as OPDAT. I'm going to ask the ABA to, in the chat, box to put up our website address to find out more details. You can, at your leisure, check out our website and get a lot more details about what we do. We work throughout the world, about 50 countries right now, I believe, working with our foreign partners to strengthen and reform their criminal justice systems, to bring all of us up to best practices, international standards, and to tackle various kinds of, to fight terrorism and tackle various kinds of transnational crime. And for all that, we receive primarily our funding from the State Department. So thank you very much. In tackling various complex issues, we work through with many of our interagency partners, many of them who were able to join us today. EPA, International IJRC, U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, ENRD, Environmental Natural Resources Division. We, in working throughout the world, we work with, we touch upon the investigation and prosecution of environmental crimes. We do that work. We have a counter wildlife trafficking resident legal advisor in Southeast Asia. We work with Romanians, our Romanian counterparts, our Colombian counterparts. So hopefully if some of them can share their experiences. Many books, I'm sure, have been written about what environmental justice is. I'm not going to tackle that. As I've indicated, what OPDAT hopes to do today, Miles, our resident legal advisor, one of them from Mexico, Miles Rainier, has helped start an environmental crimes working group. And so it's just to show what this means in practice, how we OPDAT and as part of the framework of this bicentennial agreement between the U.S. and Mexican governments, how OPDAT is helping build the capacity to investigate, build the capacity of Mexican counterparts to investigate and prosecute environmental crimes. So that's what you're going to hear from today. So I'll just turn it over to my colleague, Steve, now. Thank you.
Thanks, Derry, and good morning and good evening, everybody. I just wanted to say a few words to frame today's discussion before I introduce our moderator, EPA's Principal Deputy General Counsel, Melissa Hoffer, to kick off the discussion. First, to express my appreciation to the JusTRAC Plus program for making this session possible. It's great to see recognition of the linkage between promoting environmental justice and the rule of law. Environmental justice is a priority for this administration, so we welcome the opportunity for a cross-agency discussion today. And just a few weeks ago, EPA Administrator Michael Regan announced the agency's international priorities. And of course, the announcement highlighted the importance of environmental justice and equity, as well as climate, transboundary pollution, environmental infrastructure and green jobs, and strengthening environmental governance in countries around the world. In EPA's Office of General Counsel, where I sit, we are engaged in sharing our experience in drafting and implementing environmental laws and regulations, including on providing meaningful access to information, opportunities for public participation, and access to justice under our domestic legal framework, as well as in substantive areas of environmental law, and with our Enforcement and Compliance Office colleagues, enforcement of environmental laws. To my mind, that interest in effective governance is distinct from the idea of a human right to a healthy environment, which comes up in at least one of the presentations today. The latter is a hotly contested issue in legal circles, and as our State Department colleagues remind us, the U.S. does not support a human right to a clean environment. In my experience, the most effective way for countries to foster a clean environment is to adopt concrete legal provisions to protect the environment and to provide for access to environmental information, and then to implement and to enforce those provisions. Countries that lack effective legal mechanisms for implementation and enforcement struggle to achieve a healthy environment. Our speakers this morning will share perspectives on cutting-edge tools for advancing environmental justice and measuring impacts, and case studies on the work that's being done on the ground to advance environmental justice, and also to highlight possibilities for innovative foreign assistance programming. So with that, I would like to remind everyone that you have the full bios and to kick this over to EPA's Principal Deputy General Counsel, Melissa Hoffer, to launch the discussion. Melissa, please take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Steve and Derry and Mary Margaret. I'm really thrilled to be here today. This is my first introduction to JusTRAC, so it's very exciting to hear about your work and just even preparing for today to learn a little bit more about it. So I'm very grateful and appreciate this opportunity. So environmental justice, I think everyone knows by now, is a centerpiece of the Biden administration. And very shortly after taking office, President Biden issued an executive order that directed all federal agencies, and not just the EPA, to make achieving environmental justice a part of their missions. And specifically called upon agencies to develop programs and policies and activities that would address the disproportionately high and adverse human, environmental, and climate-related and other cumulative impacts on disadvantaged communities, as well as accompanying economic challenges of such impacts. So, environmental justice, we all know the legacy of environmental injustice and the way that tends to show up in people's lives. Over the course of my career practicing as an environmental lawyer, I have seen that manifest in a variety of ways, from debilitating health conditions, acute health conditions, a lack of access to opportunity, and that might mean a lack of access to public transportation, living near highways, going to schools that are on the site of areas that are surrounded by polluting industry. And these are things that when I think about the phrase environmental justice and how, it's such a sort of hot phrase right now that everybody is, it's easy, but what it really comes down to is the ability of someone to live a full life and to have the confidence that your children will have a chance to grow up without addressing and struggling with health issues. It's the ability to be able to have that enjoyment of your life without knowing you're going to be dealing with this problem that often is very difficult to change because it derives from more or less structural inequities in our society. So it's a huge challenge for us here at EPA, and it's not one that can be, easily remedied. It's something that requires a real consolidated, comprehensive effort across everything that we're doing. So that's what we're engaged in right now. It's at the heart of everything that EPA is doing. If you know this agency, there's a lot of ways in which environmental justice can show up, and that's everything from rulemakings to individual permits to adjudications to how we do grants. So it's very, very important, and we're in the process now of really integrating all that stuff in a nuts and bolts way. We're going to hear more today, I think, about screening tools. Everybody knows EPA's EJ screen. And then, the real hard part is how do you bake it into everything that you're doing? And that's what we're really focused on at the agency now. So in addition to that, about 40% of the overall benefits from the federal investments that we're making right now in climate and energy are going to be flowing to disadvantaged communities. And that's under, you may have heard of our cross-agency Justice 40 initiative. And that's what that represents. So that's a real commitment to spending and how we're spending our dollars to make sure that we are prioritizing the places that haven't in the past had opportunity to have those investments and resources in their communities. As well, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA is making historic investments in communities that are overburdened by pollution and trying to solve some of these legacy environmental justice issues. And that might show up in the form of old Superfund sites that have not been fully remediated, access to water infrastructure. So we've been doing a lot around getting lead out of water supply pipelines and other water infrastructure and safe drinking water in other respects. So today we have a great panel for you. We have experts from EPA, the Department of Justice, and World Resources Institute. As Steve mentioned, you can access their bios independently, so we don't have to take our time today to go through that, but I do encourage you to read them and just see what everyone's incredible accomplishments are. And first, we're going to be hearing from Danny Gogol from our own EPA Office of Environmental Justice. He's going to be talking a little bit more about how we use that term environmental justice here at EPA and how we're measuring progress in terms of our accomplishments to really make a difference on the ground. And we're going to hear from Miles Rainiers from DOJ, who's going to be presenting on the EJ working group that's established with the government of Mexico. And then finally from Elizabeth Moses, who is with the World Resources Institute. And Elizabeth is going to be walking us through a case study on WRI's use of its community action toolkit for using access to environmental information to help fight pollution and advocate for public health. So as soon as we get through the presentations, we're going to open it up for questions for all of you. We're really excited to discuss these issues and hear your perspectives. So I'm going to turn it over to Danny. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. And I want to thank everyone for inviting me and others on the panel for this presentation. Looking forward to the questions that you may have after we present to you. So there's been a lot of discussion about environmental justice, and there's perhaps some questions about what environmental justice means, at least from the EPA and in many regards the federal government. And since we're talking within an international context for this particular presentation, there's lots of other thoughts about what environmental justice means. So I want to at least present just a quick overview of what the US EPA has been identifying as its definition for decades now, and many of the other agencies have adopted this. So it's really focused on two key principles of fair treatment and meaningful involvement. Certainly with the EPA within the context of our the development and implementation of our federal environmental programs, as well as enforcement of those programs. And the two principles themselves are further defined in the presentation. I'm not going to, because of the interest of time, I'm not going to go ahead and read off those definitions, but they are going to be in the PowerPoint, and this information will be provided to you. But the key thing here is to highlight the two principles of fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, and respect, once again, for EPA, development, implementation, enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Next slide, please. Here's a further breakdown of what we mean by meaningful involvement. I think this is really important to take a look at within the context of looking at ways to measure, assess how not only other countries, but the US government itself is going about providing for environmental justice. This gets into some specifics about the ability of those that are most impacted by decisions that are made by government for participating in decision-making of those bodies, and particularly for EPA, the federal agencies, but also that there's opportunities for their involvement, and then that there's a proactive effort on the part of the governments to engage those that might be impacted by those decisions. So this is something else for folks to take a look at a little more deeply when they have some time. Next slide, please. So the agency, this is just a general slide we have in terms of a sense of how we go about looking at environmental justice. So I know that this is a JusTRAC. There's a legal aspect to what you all do. So rooted in law and focuses on the programmatic integration of EJ considerations and how the law is applied. There's a big emphasis on partnerships. Within the United States, we recognize very well, certainly EPA, that environmental justice is not just about the environment per se within the mission of the agency, but as Melissa talked about, transportation and housing and education, all these factors. It's really a quality of life question. So partnerships are incredibly important within that context. This notion that we are to collaborate and create, have creative approaches protecting the environment and health and address health hazards that are affecting most vulnerable and I would say underserved communities. And so once again, it's not just partnerships within the federal family, but all other potential partners that can work with and in communities to address their priority needs. And the holistic approach, philosophy, if you will. And then once again, this notion of equal access to fair treatment and decision-making, the processes to pursue a healthy environment in which to live, work, play, pray, and go to school, and anything else that folks do in their communities. So these are some of the things that you might want to think about sharing as you're engaging with other countries. it's really a matter of trying to be responsive to the needs of vulnerable, underserved communities. And what are those practical ways to do that? So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that the agency's been doing and is doing or seeking to do relative to accomplish these particular objectives. Next slide, please. So a couple tools. You heard Melissa mention EJ Screen. It is the agency's and for the most part, the federal government's primary tool for incorporating our nationally consistent data to try to identify areas of what we call potential environmental justice concern. This is not a tool to identify all quote unquote communities with EJ concerns. It's an impractical to envision that we'd have a tool like that because it's all based on the data we have. And we know that we don't have all the data that would be ideal to understand exactly which communities are most affected by the pollution and other environmental issues or impacts that are happening in communities. So this tool is a good tool. It uses the data that we currently have that once again is nationally consistent. It's better than nothing, as the saying goes, but it does have some shortcomings because it's all dependent on the data that we have and the accuracy of that data. The other thing I want to talk about is something we are touting as community work. And this is a recognition that we need to be working with communities to be responsive to their priority concerns, and that we need to ensure that we're effectively coordinating within the agency across the board with all of our interactions with communities, that we're not doing these in what we call stovepipe, just one particular program, just looking at waste issues or just looking at water issues or just looking at air issues. We need to be cognizant of the fact that we need to coordinate all that work as we're working in and with communities to address their priority concerns. So these are two tools I'm going to talk a little bit more about in detail. Next slide, please. So starting with EJ Screen, I mentioned that it is a tool that looks at our demographic data and our environmental data for identifying areas of potential EJ concerns. It is a public tool, and we have just recently updated it to make it a little bit more user-friendly and to add some other data that helps us to look at some of the issues that may be more affecting rural communities. And there's also some data that was put in there relative to the climate issues. So we're pretty excited about having those additional updates, and particularly that addition of data. And it's called EJ Screen 2.0. It's just to highlight the fact that we had some enhancements to it. Next slide, please. So a little more information about this data. There's 12 environmental indicators. There's some of them listed right here on the map that was pulled up from the actual tool. There's 7 demographic indicators, and then we have something called 12 EJ indexes. And in each of the indexes, our EJ index combines the demographic factors with the single environmental factors. So there's ways of slicing and dicing this, if you will, and looking at things of particular interest in the particular communities that you have a focus on. Next screen, please. So these are them broken down specifically what those 12 environmental indicators are. And you can see those. I'm not going to read them off. The 7 demographic indicators in the upper right-hand corner. And this gets combined, and ultimately there's a identification of perhaps some of the areas that are most impacted by the environment relative to the pollution and whatnot that we are aware of. And once again, it's only based obviously on the data that we have available to us. So it's a tool. This is really important to point this out. It's a tool that helps us identify places that we need then to go and do some further research and engagement, and actually visiting ideally the community to better assess what's happening in that community, so we can more fully and effectively try to address the concerns that exist there. Next slide, please. So the next 5 or 6 slides, I'm not going to go through these, but we put these in here just so you could, at your leisure, go through and get a sense of how this information is shown and can be seen on the tool itself. So if you follow this later on at your leisure, you can just follow through and then see how it drills down further and further and enables you to get a sense of what you'll be able to see from using the tool. Of course, it's publicly available. All of you can go in and look at your own communities, and that might be something like you do just to get a sense of, your area, your community, so you get a sense of what shows up there and what doesn't show up there. And I think there's one more slide. There we go. So community work. This is something that the agency is starting to focus on. I think you heard Melissa mention at the very beginning, or someone did, maybe it was Steve. We have the core functions of EPA are regulatory development, permitting, enforcement, compliance, cleanup, financial assistance. These are things that most folks are aware of, that the agency is actively engaged in. What you may not know is that we also have been working in communities, directly over the course of time. But the one thing that we've come to appreciate is we don't do that consistently, and we don't have it as an understanding that it's something we need to do as a core function, not as whenever we get a chance to do it, or when a particular administration comes in and wants to create an initiative to focus on communities, and those things come and go. So we are doubling down quite a bit on this, and trying to have us as an agency develop an understanding that community work is a core function. It needs to be understood as a business practice. And I share that with you because this is really important to share with other countries, right? It's this thing, if we're going to be trying to truly address environmental justice, it cannot be done if we're not working in and with communities. And that's something that EPA has come to appreciate and understand, and why this is now becoming such a big focus for us. So, you see the points in here that I've already walked through and talked through. So not only is it to, perhaps identify ways that we can better coordinate within the agency, but it's also how we're trying to collaborate with all of the potential partners, federal agencies, state governments, tribal governments, business industry, academia, pretty much the whole range of entities that could help and work with communities to address their priority environmental and public health concerns, as well as other quality of life needs. And then the idea is to share best practices, develop some some tools and understand of how to do this work effectively, and continuously improve upon and share those best practices. The next slide, and I think I have one that breaks down. Yes, good. So practically, what does this mean and how do we do it? It's got three key principles: community driven, right? Right off the bat, there's this recognition when we're talking about environmental justice is that we're responding to the community. We're not dictating to them what should be done. We're not telling them, hey, this is the priority of the federal government, and this is what we're coming to do to you or for you. But what are your issues? And then what are the missions and the authorities? What are the programs that we have in existence that can help you meet those needs? This is a really important thing, and I get in myself a little bit of trouble with my colleagues when we start talking about prioritizations of the agency. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have priorities in the EPA or the federal government or other governments around the world, but those are important because we have certain objectives and goals we're trying to accomplish. But if we're truly going to be adherent to the principles of environmental justice, we're responding to their priority issues. We can make them aware of the programs and resources we have, because if they don't know about something, they can't aspire to it. But the key thing here is that we listen to what their concerns are, and then we try to work with them to address those concerns. And if it doesn't fall within our mission or authorities within the context of EPA, and we're out in the community, we need to reach out to those agencies that do have that mission authority, as well as other states and perhaps NGOs and nonprofit groups, whatever the case may be. Okay, so the coordinated collaborative, I talked about this a little bit. The coordinated part, we use that term within the context of working within EPA with our respective programs and regions to be responsive to the community's needs. And the collaborative term we use predominantly with federal agencies, states, tribes, local governments, business industry, academia, you name it, all the other potential partners that could be brought in to work with the community. And the last part, the community of practice. Once again, if you don't measure something, this is obviously the focus of this particular session. If you're not tracking your progress, you're not assessing how effective you are, you're not reporting on that, you're not identifying best practices, the likelihood of you succeeding much in your stated objectives is pretty slim. So the last slide I think we have, and if not, I'm still going to speak about it. Okay, the webinar series. There is one more thing I'm going to talk about. I don't have on the slides. Just backing up. You don't have to move the slides. I'll talk about this last slide in a second. But the whole thing of measurement. So the EPA just came out with its 2022-2026 strategic plan. And there are a couple measures in there or commitments relative to work in communities. So we're right now in the thick of trying to develop what those measures are going to be, how we're going to assess the progress in implementing community work, how we're going to assess the progress in addressing the needs of the communities to be in response to those needs. So I know that you all will be interested in what we come up with. So at a future date, someone can ping me. I'll be happy to share with you what we develop, and that's going to be public knowledge as well. So we're held accountable to those commitments and how we're going to try to measure it. So the last thing is, and I put this in here about this webinar series, because it's great to have policies and programs and objectives and commitments, but you got to have some public-facing engagement where the agency is sharing our resources and programs, if you will, but we're also opening up ourselves to some questions and from the public. And so we have two webinar series that we've done. One was with states to help states share with each other about some of their best practices. That one is not right now functioning, if you will. We don't have any webinars planned for that series, but we do have another series for tribes and indigenous peoples that I actually manage. And we've been doing that once a month. Same concept, that we're working with federally recognized tribes and indigenous peoples to try to address the areas of interest to them, the topics of concern, to help them build some capacity, and to share the resources that we have to help them to address those issues. And then the last thing is we have regularly national calls on environmental justice to once again open ourselves up to hear from the public, to share information about some of the key programs that are happening in EPA, hear from the concerns of the public, and try to respond to those issues. So this is another really important component of environmental justice. It has to be something that we open ourselves up to and make it real for interaction and engagement and responsiveness. So thanks for the time. I hope that I didn't go over my time, but these slides will be available to you for future reference.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Danny. That was wonderful. And let's move right away to hear from Miles.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Can y'all hear me? You can give me a thumbs up. Great. My name is Miles Rainier, and I'm a federal prosecutor from New Orleans. I'm going to talk about two things today. One is kind of working interagency, with people in your own government. And then two is intergovernment work, working with different countries as far as hopefully arriving at the goals of achieving or beginning to work on environmental justice. So I am currently a resident legal advisor at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. I come from New Orleans at the U.S. Attorney's Office there, where I worked in the public corruption section, but I had also done some environmental crimes work, including the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well as the Lacey Act prosecutions. I am here, fortunately, because of the State Department's INL division funds the opportunity for prosecutors like myself to come to places, developing parts of the world to help promote justice and further the possibilities of their criminal justice systems. All right, can we go to slide 3 or the next slide? Right. So when I got here, I had this prosecution background, and we're trying to promote criminal justice here in Mexico. And I was fortunate to meet a couple of officers and agents from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as from the NOAA. And these were agents who had been assigned to the Office of the United States Trade Representative and were working in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. And they are tasked with enforcing the environmental provisions and the USMCA, which is basically the new version of NAFTA. It's the trade agreement that governs Mexico, United States, and Canada. And each country is supposed to meet its obligations under the treaty. And these gentlemen approached me because they knew I worked with the Mexican Attorney General's office and asked if I was aware of the vaquita, and I was not. Well, the vaquita is an endangered marine mammal, like a small dolphin or porpoise, that exists in the northern Gulf of California. And unfortunately, it lives in the same area as a fish called the tatuaba. John Gates, can you go forward one slide just for a second? So we're talking about this area between Baja California and Sonora. Particularly, a lot of this fishing originates out of San Felipe. Okay, can we go back to the vaquita slide? Thank you. All right, so the tatuaba is a fish. It's like a drum, and its bladder is thought to have medicinal properties that are very valuable in a lot of Asian markets. And just to give you a sense of how valuable it is, a gram of this tatuaba bladder is worth more than a gram of cocaine, like on the black market. And there's also a lot of poverty that exists in this part of Mexico, and it creates a lot of pressure for people to fish the tatuaba. And unfortunately, the vaquita gets caught in the nets, and the population of this mammal has suffered dramatically. And the best estimates right now that there are only 8 of these left in the world. So on the right is a photo of kind of the pangas, these Mexican fishing boats that are out there, and they fish for the tatuaba with big nets. All right. So these gentlemen from NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the United States Trade Representative approached me about trying to engage the Mexican Attorney General's office on this issue, and they helped me set up a meeting. And we received a really positive response from the Mexican Attorney General's office when we went there about discussing, hey, look, maybe we could work bilaterally to have a group and we could share information. All right, next slide, please. And one more. Thank you. So we started this group with the Mexican prosecutors and with representatives on our side from Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, USTR, some other federal law enforcement agencies. And the goal was to use the tools of investigation and prosecution to preserve the vaquita and other endangered species, and to support Mexico in enforcing their own environmental laws. All right, next slide, please. And included in that trade agreement that our countries are party to, that there's provisions for encouraging bilateral or trilateral working groups and information sharing. So we're acting within the confines or the suggested boundaries of the trade agreement as well. All right, next slide, please. So this is kind of a little chronology. First meeting in October, and then we were able to have this inaugural meeting of this environmental crimes working group the next month at our office here in Mexico City, courtesy of INL. And then in February, we had our last meeting of this group. And as you can see, next slide, what began as something about this endangered porpoise has kind of organically grown and expanded into other environmental issues, which we hope will continue to expand and eventually encapsulate many of the issues, environmental justice, that should be present and investigated and handled here in Mexico as well. So, what began with the vaquita, we're now looking at illegal timber harvesting, timber trafficking, shrimp fraud, the mislabeling of the origin of shrimp, that people are harvesting shrimp from areas they're not supposed to. There's also, we talked about illegal hunting of bighorn sheep, and as well as cactus smuggling and all sorts of stuff that will come up. All right, next slide. This is an example of something that, again, organically has come out of this. we were able to connect with Forestry Service, United States Forestry Service, because we were aware that they had been done some programming for Mexican counterparts. And now Forestry Service is assisting us into developing a training for Mexican prosecutors and investigators to assist them in identifying species of timber, so that when it's being exported from the Mexico across the border of the U.S., the people inspecting it can tell if it's an endangered species, or it's a species that is protected and should not be being harvested, or if it's being mislabeled. So we've just had great support and connections from all these other U.S. agencies that are, that want to work and support Mexico in enforcing their own environmental laws. All right, next slide, please. All right, and this is a kind of an example of the sort of information we get to share with them. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, that their investigators, they develop their own sources, whether it's through investigations, their Mexican counterparts, or even there's a lot of NGOs that are active trying to save the vaquita as well, and active in the Gulf of California. So we take some of this information, share it with the Mexican authorities, and hopefully it can be useful to them in doing their own investigations and connecting it to organized crime. As I'm assigned here handling the money laundering, asset forfeiture, and public corruption portfolio. So my interest in this is kind of taking the financial incentives out of organized crime and supporting Mexico to do that. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and this is just sort of an example of a successful investigation and prosecution from last year. These are the Tatawaba bladders. So these are the fish bladders that are so valuable and are exported to, generally China, that demand a lot of money and create the pressure on these very poor fishing villages to overfish, to kind of fish with reckless nets that capture a lot of bycatch and kill them, including this vaquita dolphin. But this was a prosecution or investigation that Mexico did on their own in September. But we want to kind of expand, and we're hoping that our work together is enabling them or supporting them to get the information to continue to use basically the criminal justice system to enforce and protect the environment as well. So I guess a couple of takeaways at the end. From the environmental justice perspective, we are trying to support Mexico and to reduce the incentives for foreign actors to exploit basically wealth inequality, to manipulate fishermen in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Another point I'd make is that a lack of law enforcement in this area, this northern part of Baja, the northeastern part of Baja, creates unregulated economic exploitation of natural resources. And we are trying to support the reestablishing the rule of law in towns like San Felipe and these other fishing communities. And again, no one here will be surprised, but obviously a lack of resources of the people living there creates a challenge, and it's an issue we have to recognize as we move forward, managing the sort of economic incentives to commit these sort of environmental crimes. The second main takeaway is I would like to salute the interagency work that goes on in this group. Obviously, State Department, INL funds my program. I then get to work with Fish and Wildlife Service, Homeland Security Investigations, DEA, the U.S. Trade Representative, Department of Justice, Environmental Crime Section has been very supportive of us and great. EPA, NOAA, Forestry, and a lot of other agencies. And we've had great enthusiasm and cooperation from our government partners, which won't surprise anyone here that, a lot of people who work in this field have a lot of passion and excitement for this issue, or are doing it for, because they love it and they want to protect the environment. So I think that's all I have. And just wanted to kind of share a little more like boots on the ground perspective of, how we hope that this working group will organically expand in the future to further the goals of environmental justice. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Miles. That was really terrific. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Elizabeth before we open it up to questions. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. Again, I'm Elizabeth Moses. I'm an Environmental Rights and Justice Associate. I sit in the Washington, D.C. office of WRI in the Equity Center. And I'm going to speak to you today about the toolkit that we created that really summarizes our approach for working with local communities to use their environmental rights, access to information, public participation, access to justice, to really address the impacts of pollution under what we called the Strengthening the Right to Information for People and the Environment project. Next slide. So I'm not really going to spend a lot of time going into this. I'm sure you're all very well aware, but I really did want to start by emphasizing that pollution and the sort of discriminatory and unjust practices that drive disproportionate impacts to local communities is a global problem, even if really historically we haven't framed it that way in the international development community. But it really is the same kind of environmental justice issues that we're tackling here in the United States, where the voice and the experience of sort of poor and underserved communities are being discounted, just like frontline communities in the United States. Next slide. And at the same time, I also just want to highlight that for the most part, the problem really isn't the absence of a regulatory framework. Sure, there is gaps in laws and policies in many countries that need to be strengthened, but fundamentally, environmental justice is really about the lack of political will, the lack of interest in prioritizing environmental rights and ensuring implementation of environmental laws and policies, and the enabling environment that really feeds that. Next slide. And if I could just suggest that this gap between principle and practice is sort of in a nutshell, number one, why access to information, participation, and access to justice is so important for part of the solution to addressing environmental justice and needs to be reflected in any kind of monitoring, evaluation, or measurement framework. But also, when local communities that are experiencing this inequity don't have a seat at the table, don't feel like leaders are addressing their concerns, you don't have opportunities for productive dialogue. And I'd like to just suggest that many of the protests, the conflicts, the lawsuits is really a reflection of that breakdown in trust in the decision-making process and in the leadership. So if we could go to the next slide. So this is really where the STRIPE project comes in. Between 2011 and 2020, we worked with a coalition of civil society partners in 5 different countries to support local communities and civil society to use their right to information and participation to really understand and engage in pollution decision-making at both the local and the national level. Now, in each one of these countries or communities, they were focusing on slightly different pollution challenges. In Indonesia, we worked with fisher communities along the Kujang River that were concerned about industrial point sources contaminating their river. In Thailand, we worked with people who lived around the Mataput industrial estate. In Morocco, we worked with local communities in Tangier that were very concerned with solid or landfills and solid waste management. And then in in Mongolia, in Tunisia, and in Jamaica, we worked with communities that were addressing many of the environmental and social issues associated with mining. If we could go to the next slide, please. So working with these local communities, I really want to highlight sort of 2 key points. Obviously, these are very different socio-political contexts, but 2 things that we found that were common among all these different communities. The first is local community members really do want to be engaged and typically have spent a long time, in many of the cases where we worked, decades, trying to voice their concerns and get information and opportunities to address those concerns in front of decision makers. The second similarity was really that despite such a transformation in open data and the sharing of environmental information, local communities were still having trouble accessing and wanting the local facility-specific documents that really described their concern around pollution in their local community. So it was water quality monitoring documents, it was discharge permits, it was EIAs, enforcement and compliance documents, public health documents, things like that. The national or synthesized summary information that was often available in these countries was just not enough because it didn't really provide them with the local facility specific information they wanted. If we could go to the next slide. We also identified a number of other significant barriers to engagement. Most of our local community members really didn't have a clear understanding of their rights, how and where to engage with the regulatory process. Lack of internet access and the ability to use many of the national websites or online portals remains a significant barrier in many rural communities. Challenges around the cost in traveling to government offices to collect requested information. Difficulty in understanding the unprocessed and often technical information or pollution control requirements that really are addressing the issue of their concern. In Thailand, for example, a lot of the information was available in English and not in Thai. We also found significant barriers in government officials, both understanding their rights and the responsibilities in supporting access to information and public participation. And that's especially true for the local or regional agency offices versus the national ones. And finally, the civil society groups that are working to support these local communities often lacked the tools and the support they needed to build the evidence-based advocacy campaigns and really analyze the policy and implementation gaps so that these issues could be tackled both locally and nationally at scale. Next. So this is really to address these barriers and the cumulative impacts facing these frontline communities. This is where the toolkit comes in. We essentially summarized our approach in a toolkit. It was released in late 2020, and it really provides this framework for supporting frontline communities and really helping them define and outline community-based solutions and how they can advocate for their concerns. I want to emphasize too that it was really developed and used by our partner. It highlights their work to hold government and private companies accountable. So if we could go to the next slide, and I just thought I would share the video that we used to release the toolkit because it gives you an opportunity to hear directly from some of the local communities members that we worked with. So if you could just hit the next button, it should play. Oh, I hope you guys are hearing the sound. Doesn't sound like the sound is playing.
No, we don't hear it.
All right. Sorry about that. The
visual's still pretty good, so you're good.
Thanks. Yeah. And luckily the people that are speaking are about to be in Mongolian with subtitles, so. Great. If you want to move to the next slide. Great. So essentially, the toolkit includes 8 modules that provide step-by-step guidance. So in practical terms, it helps local communities and their civil society partners understand their rights to information and participation, know what pollutants are entering their environment and where they're coming from, including the names and the specific companies that are discharging into their environment. They know the risks of those pollution, what government agency is responsible for the pollution control and what they're actually doing to control pollution, how to identify and leverage opportunities to engage decision makers, as well as develop accountability campaigns that really can focus on redress for damage and when and where it's appropriate. Next slide. So this is a long-term approach. Typically, we worked in these communities for a minimum of 3 years, but we were really able to achieve many impressive outcomes. I obviously don't have time to go into all the details, but it included passage of new regulations that expanded environmental information, stronger enforcement and compliance of environmental laws. We expanded the community's use of access to information, right to know laws, and supported their ability to do community-based monitoring of pollution. New community organizations were formed and networks, and we even really have trained trainers so that as these projects have ended, there's a group of expert civil society that can continue to work and use this methodology to support new and expanded community efforts. So if we go to the next slide, what are the lessons that we've learned from for this that I think are relevant to the conversation we're having today? I think it's many of the environmental justice sort of principles you've heard before. First and foremost, let the communities speak for themselves and really provide resources that build their capacity and expertise in these disadvantaged communities so they have the tools and strategies to engage. Foreign assistance programs can't really ignore the local level, and there's a need for these bottom-up engagement strategies to counterbalance all of the sort of top-down solutions that are currently being proposed and sort of funded. And when you invest in the frontline capacities of these communities, you effectively strengthen communication and decision-making, and you reduce the driver for all that unproductive engagement that I referenced in that conflict, in that slide before. So for my final slide, if you could just go to the last one, around measuring, the sort of insights from Stripe and the toolkit that I would want to highlight are as follows. Really, first, that the local level engagement and the ability of local communities to access this facility-specific information really should be an indicator of success. Equity and justice is also a process. It's not just an outcome. And so determining the success requires multiple forms of evaluation. It can't just be quantitative data. It needs to be qualitative data that captures the experience of these local community members. And local community members need to be involved in the measuring, what to measure, how to measure, and really how you define success. Local governments are often the regulatory authority with the enforcement and compliance or local data collection responsibilities. So it's really important to engage local government officials and ensure they have the skill building and resources and programs to be able to respond to community concerns. And finally, given the sort of historical and structural discriminatory drivers of the pollution problem, we can't ignore the implementation gap and the need to shift political incentives to better enforce and spur compliance while avoiding unintended consequences. And so that really means expanding the indicators for measuring success to look at economic opportunity, cumulative impact, impacts to housing, to health, to safety. And then finally, disaggregating all of that data by the different relevant identity factors, looking at gender, looking at income, looking at ethnicity, and really making sure that you're capturing that complete picture of the local community and the impacts that they're facing. And with that, the last slide just says thanks.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was really, really interesting and just an incredibly compelling story, particularly from Mongolia. So we're going to take a couple of questions now. We don't have a whole lot of time for questions, but I thought I might start us off with one or two. And my first question is, I'm just wondering if anyone could speak to sort of what's underlying our conversation today is kind of the difference between procedural rights and substantive rights. And so, in the United States, at least, the experience with the quintessential statute that provides rights and access to process is NEPA. And yet, that process can often be more or less of a box checking exercise. You've got your comment in, you made your comment, that's your primary right. And there's often not, in fact, with NEPA, there's no need to take that into account. And at the state level, this happens a lot as well. And there's also just sort of only so far process can take you, like think about local energy facility siting boards, for example, where you might have the ability to make a comment. But if your community really wants to be at the table to oppose the siting of new fossil infrastructure, for example, in your community, you might not have the money to do that because you're going to have a very wealthy interest on the other side that can afford experts, and you might not have the ability to actually meaningfully prosecute that right effectively. So I'm curious if anybody could speak to that issue.
I'm happy to start.
Thanks,
First of all, if it wasn't clear, the Stripe project provided funding to local communities. So we really supported both financially and through this capacity building initiative, their ability to engage. And so I think providing funding for opportunities to participate is one of the sort of fundamental sort of strategies that we can that could be considered to ensure that they really do get that seat at the table. But I do think that the larger sort of ensuring that they have the capacity, the tools, and the resources to engage fair, and have the ability to understand and negotiate and express their concerns within the regulatory context is a much long-term support issue that also needs to be considered. You can't just expect somebody who's simply experiencing pollution to be able to come to the seat at the table and have the same expertise and understanding of regulatory requirements, what their rights are. It needs to be long-term support.
Thank
you. I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to respond to that.
Sure. Just to build on that, we didn't have a lot of time to talk about all the work going on within EPA regarding environmental justice, but we do have grants that are specifically created for vulnerable and underserved communities. But even within that context, grants have limitations. People have to have the capacity to actually apply for a grant. And many of the most vulnerable and underserved do not. And they have to have an organization and a structure. They even have to understand what the opportunities exist. They have to have the connections to get to the grants.gov. And if they don't have a good bandwidth, they have challenges applying. There's lots of issues within that context. So not only grants, but technical assistance. And Elizabeth, it was great hearing you talk about what you were doing there with Mongolia, because you got to have that component, right? The capacity building component that doesn't require a grant, but staff that can go out there and work with the community. So we're looking to do more of that at EPA. And I don't want to keep talking about EPA specifically, but that's an area we know that's a gap. And the question about procedural and process and really getting at the heart of the decision making. I think Elizabeth hit it pretty heavily and right on the head that it's many regards it comes down to politics. Are the decision makers willing to make the hard, tough decisions about what it really means to protect the environment, public health, vulnerable and underserved communities? And so, within EPA, we're looking very closely again at what flexibilities do the laws provide us. And at the end of the day, are we, using those flexibilities or not? And certainly within the context of other countries, it's a similar question. And I think that was another really good point. This is across the board, the challenges that exist. But, we keep working at it. It's a matter of educating people. What I've personally found in my 30 years of work in EPA and EJ program, most folks want to do the right thing. They just don't know and they don't understand what the limitations or challenges are. And so you want to raise that awareness and identify opportunities that exist. And it's really important to include the local government and the state government with regards to EPA and those decisions and those discussions. So, just to highlight once again some of the key points that Elizabeth brought up.
Great, thank you so much. Pose another. We have a question from Allison Bartel. How do your program approaches deal with the issue of closing? I just lost this question. Let me open up the chat. How do your program approaches deal with the issue of closing civic space? In many places, environmental defenders are explicitly targeted, sometimes by government actors themselves. Elizabeth?
Yeah, so that's such an important question. Thank you. We actually are involved in a number of networks in directly supporting environmental defenders. In many ways, I just could only speak to one program for this particular 10 minutes speech, but there are a number of tools and strategies that can be used to both prevent the sort of violence and threats and intimidation, as well as support and protect current environmental defenders. But I think that in general, as it relates to the work that we've done under STRIPE, the key is really to make sure that people understand the socio-political context that they're operating under and really develop the sort of solutions, advocacy strategies that are appropriate for that country context. We try to create our toolkit so that you're doing some of that sort of systematic analysis, both the political economy analysis as well as the policy analysis, but so before you sort of jump into your advocacy, so you at least can sort of navigate a little bit more strategically that the issues in any one country. But it's a huge problem that really does need more, I think, both political and sort of civil society attention.
Melissa, if I can add on to that. So what's been happening more recently, you heard Steve Wolfson and EPA mention to you that the administrator has come out very strongly talking about environmental justice within an international context. That has not happened up until this point, at least not to my knowledge. And so there's a lot more awareness and interest in environmental justice from the standpoint of the United States. So even within the Organization of Economic Cooperative Development, we've had some discussions with them and identifying some ways that they can include EJ principles and related topics in the reviews that are happening there. The U.S. is also engaging with other countries regarding the environmental cooperation work plans for the free trade agreements. These are things that haven't happened where we include environmental justice language in these environmental cooperative plans. So there's opportunities for the U.S. government now more so than the past in the national arena to discuss openly and candidly with these countries. There's means and tools that they can seek to utilize to better be responsive to the needs of their most vulnerable and underserved communities. So that's one thing. The other thing is, basically we share in the international human rights context some of these best practices when we're reporting to the UN bodies. That's going to be happening in the CERD this particular August that's coming up. And then, if we're having these agreements and other things with them, if we highlight these as important, that helps countries recognize that there's some interest in our part to see how they're doing in this space, particularly for providing funding to them. I don't have all the expertise in what the State Department does with countries and the funding. We do quite a bit of funding from USAID and others to these countries. So there's ways to perhaps identify some means and mechanisms to include our interest in seeing some of this work advanced and share the experiences we have and be really candid about our failures, our shortcomings in our own efforts and where we're trying to work hard to do that. So we certainly don't have all the answers, and to learn from some of these other countries. So those are just some general things we can think about. And the last thing is, I shared some of the things in my presentation, mainly just to spur some thinking on the part of all of us about how we can use some of those things internationally. And certainly from the constructs of having perhaps a webinar series where we highlight some of the good work that's happening. Melissa, what you did in Mongolia with the community there, what they're able to do with their country, and to make this available to anyone interested, so folks can learn from each other and build on those experiences and promote those best practices within their own country. Thanks.
Thanks, Danny, so much. Miles, we have a couple questions for you, so I'm just going to pose them both, and you can answer them in whatever order you like. One is, did the investigation in Mexico lead to any following prosecution in the U.S.? And the other is, you did your presentation really laid out very starkly the intersection between, sort of this extreme wealth disparity or economic disparity, and then pressures on biodiversity, environmental degradation. So I was curious, as a complement to the enforcement strategy, are you thinking, or are the Mexican government considering financial incentives for the conservation of the fish?
Great questions. I guess the first one, the answer, has it led to any U.S. prosecution? The answer is not yet, but we're hoping that in the future that these types of investigations will be able to identify bad actors on sort of both sides of the border with, illegal cactus smuggling, the Totawaba bladders, and other things, crimes that we know are currently being committed. ENRD, the environmental wing of the Department of Justice, supports and works with a lot prosecutors in Arizona, in Southern California, and they've done a lot of these types of cases before, but this specifically, has our work led to that kind of prosecution yet? No, but that's one of the goals. I believe the second question was, have we integrated with the Mexican government, outside of the Attorney General's office in terms of finding a way to support these communities? The answer is no, not yet. Obviously, a more holistic approach would probably be more effective, but we're just not there yet, and we're just kind of focusing on kind of keeping the Mexican prosecutors pumped up to keep investigating, and but there are pressures from other parts of society. There's been a fair amount of media coverage about the vaquita and other things. So we're hoping those, will continue to pressure other parts of the Mexican government. But it would be a little bit outside of my mission here, as it's been defined by the State Department. But we do work. State Department has political section and economic section and a consulate in Tijuana, and they're aware of this sort of stuff, and they do more of that kind of work. But great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Mark, do we have time for one more, or should I turn it back to you?
I think we have time for one more if it's a very quick one, and then we have Derry wrap things up and go to the Mentimeter survey just to respect folks' time. Thanks.
Okay, great. We have a really good question from him. In the excellent presentations, I missed the relation between EJ and access to justice, also in the context of international threats to the environment, as well as the capacity to enforce environmental legislation. Should this be included in a measurement tool? Pim has a related question that I'm going to try to synthesize. The EJ screening tool is an excellent tool to visualize certain aspects of EJ. It is also tested and applied outside. Is it also tested and applied outside of the US? Would it be a good idea to measure the level of environmental justice at local, state, and national, international levels? So we're having a question about, are we using EJ screen outside of the US? Can we measure the levels of environmental justice at different levels, of government, local, state, and international? And then the sort of additional thought about what is the relation between EJ and access to justice in the context of international threats? So maybe we could loop in, some thinking about how a screen like EJ screen could particularly be used for addressing international threats. Thanks. Danny, I suppose you would like to jump in with that maybe first.
Sure, and this is when I wish we had an hour so we can talk. But at any rate, so yeah, we haven't used EJ Screen internationally because it's all based on the data, and we don't have data that we put into there that's within international context. It could be. That's an interesting idea. The folks, perhaps, and I don't know who collects data or if other countries share data with us. That's something we can certainly offer to them. It's not a tool that's restrictive. If you have the data, you want to put it in, you can use it. I don't know about the maps in terms of whether it's outside the United States, but that's an interesting question. The other about the connection with EJ and international justice issues and whatnot, it really boils down to, if you have laws on the books that protect the environment and public health within a particular country, how are those laws being applied? Are they being applied equally, fairly, and are the people that are most affected by decisions that are impacting their community being involved in those decision making and in those decisions, and are their concerns being considered by any authority that has the responsibility to implement those laws? So that's the connection. To me, it's a very clear connection. We haven't been articulating it because we haven't done this work in international context, but it's out there, and Elizabeth, I think, did a really good job of making that connection.
Last word, Elizabeth or Miles?
Just let me quickly say two things. The first is that, whether you're talking about international challenges like climate change or pollution, those problems have to be translated into a regulatory framework that does trickle down all the way to the local level. So there's not time to kind of go through the connections that need to be made, but really what is happening at the city or in a rural area, I think, has real implications. And it might itself be a good indicator for how well those sort of international challenges are being addressed in particular countries. The other thing I'll just quickly add is this is based in work that I'm currently doing in Africa with civil society partners around environmental rights, where we did look at the court system, and many of the similar barriers and challenges to engaging around access to information and public participation are true for the legal systems in these African countries, in terms of it being a very lengthy and expensive process to use, it being unclear how to engage, and also it being something that sort of happens after the damage or the concern. So there are many specific barriers to access to justice that I think around community engagement, and that being a effective mechanism for redress, that could be an entire another topic of conversation for this panel.
All right, well, that is, we will await the next installment, which I would be really eager for. This was fantastic. I so appreciated the presentations this morning. So thank you, Elizabeth and Danny and Miles, very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa and Elizabeth and Danny and Miles for the presentations. Most appreciative, and it sounds like we definitely have our next community of practice topic on tap. And also would just really encourage everyone, John Gates has the Mentimeter information. If you please go ahead now before you leave us and finish that survey for us, it would really be most helpful. And then I encourage everyone to go to the Knowledge Portal and continue the discussion. There's the Justice Sector Measurement Discussion Board, which is the opportunity for you to continue to flesh out these questions and share information and continue to coordinate and collaborate. And we will make the recording information available on the Knowledge Portal as well. So if you'd like to share this with others going forward, we welcome you doing that. Thanks very much to Steve and Derry as well for taking the lead here. And of course, always to INL and our State Department colleagues for support to the JusTRAC program. So thanks so much for filling out the survey. We'll look forward to being in touch with all the community of practice members in the future for the next community meeting, and welcome your ideas and suggestions on what those topics should be so that they're meeting your needs and meeting your interests. So don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know. And again, thanks very much for a really interesting topic and continuing discussion. All the best to everyone.
Thanks, Mary Margaret.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.